Tired of transcription headaches? Trent's automated transcription software can convert video, audio, and speech to text in more than 40 languages with up to 99% accuracy. Tell your stories faster by transcribing, translating, editing, and collaborating in a single workflow. We use Trent for this podcast, and it really does make a difference. Honestly, if you don't want your transcripts to be used for training algorithms, Trent really is the place to be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Operations Room, a podcast for COOs. I am Brandon Mensinger, joined by my lovely co-host, Bethany Ayers. How are things going, Bethany?
Hey, I'm back to being lovely. I always notice which way the intro is. Things are okay. I am not in the Christmas spirit. Do you have a Christmas tree up yet?
Yes, we have a Christmas tree. So I'm allergic to actual Christmas trees or whatever, pine trees or what have you. So we can't actually have them, which is a boon, to be honest, because I don't have to deal with A, buying one, B, dealing with all the pine needles everywhere and so on. So we have a fake tree, the same tree that goes up every year. We actually just got I don't even know what you call it. They give it like this massive bundle of all the crafts that the kids have done over the past 3 months. So it is a huge batch of stuff. And you always wonder what to do with these things, right? Mm-hmm. You're like, oh, it's like, so you have to parse through it. You know, what are the golden nuggets that you want to save? And then the rest of it, you have to obviously put through recycling.
But you have to gently put it through, right? Or, subtly put it through. And nobody can discover. But yet they will never remember it again. So as long as you do it without getting caught, it's absolutely fine. It just isn't feeling Christmassy here. I don't quite know when I'm taking time off work. So I feel like I'm just in this limbo of work is really, really, really busy. And yet the sun came up at 7:30 in the morning. It goes down before 4. My whole body wants to cocoon. And yet work is like the busiest period of the year. I always find this really difficult. And we still have about 4 deals to sign that are going to happen sometime between now and the 31st, which again means that you can't entirely breathe out. And they're big enterprise deals. They have been in close plans since October, with everybody saying we want to close before Christmas, everybody going 100% we're going to close before Christmas. And then it just slips. And then it just slips a little bit more. And then suddenly it's the 31st.
That's a lot of pressure. Yeah.
And then something I want to talk to you about, Brandon, was our strategy days. We've done strategy in October and we've done strategy in January. And this year, maybe because I joined middle of September, we've ended up pushing the strategy day back to January again. So not only was there board meetings, budget planning, end of year wrap up, I also spent a lot of yesterday thinking through our strategy day and format and pre-reads and questions to cover for when we come back. When do you do your strategy days and how do you do your strategy days? Or what way do you think works the best?
I would say that I feel like the December team week, I think to me is the right time generally to do this stuff, because you want a time period where clearly there is time and space to reflect on what has happened. You know what I mean? I think this whole reflection on how has the year gone? What does it look like? How has it felt to us? What results have we seen or not seen? And the learnings taken away from that very clearly is kind of like a December mojo thing, I would say, or vibe. And it's definitely not a vibe you're going to get in January, where it's like, go, go, go. The second piece is the nomenclature part of it, which is I always used to call this strategy day or strategy days or strategy week or whatever. And at some point, somebody was telling me, like, look, Brandon, every day is strategy day. Every day you should be thinking in the back of your head around what are we doing? And it puts a lot of pressure on the week itself as well to like somehow deliver some transformative new strategy or better strategy or whatever you want to call it, I guess. So we ended up calling it Team Week. And Team Week is reflective of the team itself, the reflection on the year, and the team thinking about the year ahead of us.
It's interesting. I like that. I agree in the strategy is every day. And also, so the new way that we're meeting as an exec team is we meet twice a week. And at first I was like, oh my God, that's a lot of meetings. But actually it works really well because we have 2 maximum 1-hour meetings a week. And I say maximum because sometimes we're done in 35 minutes and other times we take the full hour. And the first meeting of the week, we do our WBR, so weekly business review. And so the WBR has forecast, pipeline, SQLs, cash collected, which is mostly like a help needed if somebody, we need to escalate that somebody's not paying, that they're ignoring us or whatever. We had one of those the other week. I don't know if I should be sharing this or not, but I'm not sharing names. We had one of the other week where he just wasn't paying. And it's escalated to me, and I was prepared for this really tough conversation. And I just said, so basically, let me explain how we see it. And he went, okay, I guess we have to pay. And then he paid. And I was like, it was the easiest conversation I've ever had.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was amazing.
Sometimes you just have to ask.
Well, it was like pushing back to junior people. And I guess maybe just having a senior person do it. I honestly have no idea. Or we hadn't explained it well.
Explain the invoice in a different way.
Yeah. Or like, yeah, exactly. Pretty much I was just like, this is what you've paid. This is what you need to pay. And he went, okay. So we talk about like cash collection, monthly active users, weekly active users of a couple different products, that kind of stuff. And so we run through it. Sometimes there's a conversation. Sometimes there's not much of a conversation at all. So it can be anything from 10 minutes to half an hour, depending on if something's surfaced. And then we bring up whatever other topics we need. And then we have a second meeting on a Thursday where it is whatever topics we need to cover as a group. But that will often, if there aren't any just like BAU stuff, will just become discussions over a topic that somebody's thinking about. And so we have like these kind of like micro strategy chats or working through and untangling something on a very regular basis. And that seems to be working well, and not having it be as structured.
So generally, I think you're onto something here, because I found a similar strand eventually, and it took me a while to realize what was happening and why it was happening, but very similar thing, which is we had a structured leadership meeting, which was 90 minutes, which eventually turned into a 2-hour block once a week that we would have. That 2-hour block would be half kind of like WBR stuff. So the key KPIs of the business, making sure that we're on that, tracking that, and accountable to that, and looking at the gaps, why they were happening, and kind of assigning out kind of outcomes and next steps to resolve issues. And then the second half of that meeting was kind of cross-functional problems that we were having, where we had pre-reads coming into those meetings to discuss a particular topic that was well set up or structured in the sense of, here's the pre-read, here's what the issue is, here's a bunch of the thoughts behind it. Now, collectively, let's get together and have a structured conversation as to how to get to an outcome or a set of next steps that can put this problem to bed so we never see it again effectively. So we would do this, and it kind of worked, and it was kind of okay. And at some point, I think the CEO founder kicked off a different thing almost in a way, like essentially getting together for coffee. And it wasn't the entire leadership team. It was just the C-suite. And at that point, there was 4 of us having this coffee, and completely unstructured, throwing out thoughts and having ideas. And the power of that conversation ultimately, I think, was better than our structured meeting in terms of the thoughts we were having. They were much more organic, much more creative, much more riffing, I would say. There's like a different feel to having a discussion where you're kind of bouncing off each other, where it's not geared up as like this thing of like, okay, we have a pre-read and it's a big conversation. Everyone's ready for it. There's a bit of like defensive posturing and I don't know, all that other stuff that comes with structured meetings. Ultimately for us and ultimately for the company, that's what we parsed it down to eventually, which is, okay, let's do our WBRs and let's have this coffee chat and open it up to the rest of leadership as well and have this kind of like wider discussion a little bit that was more unstructured. So I think eventually we found a route to kind of what you're doing.
And what we've also done to have those slightly more structured conversations is we do a MBR once a month. And how that works is we have a set of ready-made slides or, like areas that we look at. It's like basically similar to what we share with the board. So financial performance, forecast, pipeline, SQLs, MQLs again. And then the kind of the equivalent, you can see where my spike is. Like that's, where's the money and are we getting more money? But then we have similar ones for product and people and engineering. And then we try and keep that to like maximum 30 slides so that it's really all that actually matters. And it's pretty standard. So because it's like, I think people forget that creating slides is not only onerous on the person creating them, but it's onerous on the person who has to read them. And so it's down to the person creating them to make sure that they're sharing the most important information rather than all the information. And so it's actually hard to keep it limited to what we need. People tend to sneak in a little bit more. And then the feedback is it's getting too long and it's hurting my brain. And then we have to like strip stuff out again. And then we have in certain areas where we're working through harder problems, bits of analysis. And so anyhow, I read the whole deck ahead of time and then think about the themes, the topics we need to resolve and my analysis on it. And so then the agenda basically changes every month. We do like a very quick run through of what do we need to know about everybody's area? And then we cover 1 to 3 topics in detail. And I'll work through the data and what other people have said and the analysis that they've shared, come up with a framing, and then we work it through. And so that's almost like we're dealing in a way, again, with some of the strategy stuff monthly.
And then for this monthly review, it's again with the leadership team and the slide creation of who's creating that. Is that each of the functional leaders doing their pieces and then parsing that together, or how does that happen?
So some of it is FP&A, like a large chunk of it is FP&A because it's the same stuff that we're sending to the board. And then there'll be the functional leaders will have maybe a little bit extra that isn't stuff that goes to the board. Like monthly active users is not something that the board is caring about.
I think that's a fantastic idea because you're doing 2 things quite usefully, actually, which is every single month you're on a pathway to the quarters review with the board in a very similar format. So you are, as a leadership team, being accountable and tracking to the progression of the company and the same kind of progression that the board is going to want to see at the end of the quarter. So by the time you get to the end of that quarter, you have to do nothing special at that point because you've been tracking this month to month up until that point, which is great. The second bit of the strategic analysis on a monthly basis, there has to be some place in the organization where that occurs because it's not going to happen in your weekly sessions. It has to happen somewhere. And then it becomes a question of, do you do it monthly or do you do it quarterly? In my previous company, we did it more on the quarterly basis. However, we also had another meeting that was happening, which is every cross-functional OKR team where leadership was involved in those OKR teams as well. We would basically have the OKR teams come together and basically present their progress for the month. So we had 4 cross-functional teams, and therefore we had 4 kind of monthly reviews on OKR progress. And maybe that's a slightly different thing that we're talking about, but it's another batch of meetings that are tracking the progress of the company. In this case, it's on the, what you define as the most important things in the business to progress on. So I'm not sure what you make of that.
It's just really interesting because it's how every business runs. And I'm not even convinced that what we're doing is perfect. I don't think there is such a thing as perfect. I mean, it sounds reasonable to me, basically. I haven't done it. It comes down to the culture of the business. And I suspect that what the meetings are and when they're held is less important than how effective the meetings are. And it's almost like, how do you get to the point of efficacy rather than copying somebody else's schedule?
And this is where the culture of the company and the particular trappings of the company comes in, because we had a very good, healthy culture around accountability for the OKRs. It was the teams that drove the process, I would say, behind doing these cross-functional monthly reviews or progress check-ins. And they put in a good, clear effort to ensure they could articulate that in terms of, where the initiatives were at, where the results were at, what the month had looked like, what the next month ahead would look like. And those sessions from an efficacy standpoint, I thought were really super valuable and very, very useful.
Previously, I have spent a tremendous amount of time tracking activity, like agreeing actions and making sure people do actions and a high level accountability around action. And what I've started doing this time around is not really focusing on the action at all. And maybe because it's the exec team and a lot of the doers are not in that meeting, but it's around surfacing areas where we need to have the hard conversations. And it's basically the problem keeps arising because we don't make the decision, or we don't have the conversation, or we talk around something and then kind of feel like we have a resolution and everybody goes, okay. But if you look back and reflect, we have no resolution. And what I'm really doing is focusing on let's resolve something, or let's realize we can't resolve it because we need more information. Let's go and find the information and then reopen the conversation. So being very clear on whether or not we have resolution. And that seems to be a real unlock. way more than an action tracker.
I think sometimes when you have these conversations, various things happen in people's heads, right? Where they're like, I kind of buy into this, but I kind of don't. Or more often than not, I kind of buy into this, but I kind of don't care. So therefore, in earnest, I'm not really going to try to solve this problem. And what ends up happening is that that problem will come back into the leadership meeting in a mutated form at some point down the road. And you're kind of looking at it again. You're like, well, why is this happening? This gets to the culture of the leadership team and the facilitator that's helping make it happen, which is sussing out at the end of that meeting, probably at the beginning too, to be honest, which is like, how much do we care about this? Like, do we honestly, the problem that we're talking, like we all have 1,000 things to do. Is this an important problem that we should talk about now? Is it urgent enough? Is it pervasive enough? And if it is, let's talk it through. Let's come to an agreement on it and let's get it done, basically. And let's not look at this again.
I think because we're all good communicators, it can feel like you've made a decision or you've kind of gone around and you've had a chat here and you had a chat there and you've had like a complete conversation and it feels like you've made a decision. And then if you take a step back, you realize like no decision has been made. We've all just aired our views and agreed with each other's views or disagreed with each other's views, but there's not been something after that. We've discussed around the topic. I feel as though most of my career has been this experience. Like it's not unique to Peak, where we can have this really robust conversation and actually nothing has been decided. And somehow we haven't noticed it.
But it gets back to like the Lencioni 5 steps in those meetings, right? Once you've like mined for your disagreement, you've been able to air everything, you've co-created a shared understanding of the problem, and you're driving towards buy-in. And then the next step after that is like, I think, reflection back to the group saying, okay, here's what I think we've decided or what the outcome is. Do we agree to that? Like that second half of the meeting is probably the critical piece to drive it to a conclusion.
I think previously in my career, it's kind of like, oh, Lencioni, like there's so much to it. This is an obvious conversation. We've resolved it, done. Whereas really, we haven't resolved it at all. And I'm focusing much more on that now.
All right, we've got part 2 in our series, which is what are the gaps in the COO toolkit? We have a lovely returning guest. It is Divinia Knowles, and she is the founder of the COO Roundtable and the former COO of Mind Candy. So this episode really is digging into the shadow side of the COO strengths. And Divinia had talked about 4 strengths of the CEO that are Jungian archetypes, and I wanted to go through each of the 4 with you. So the first one that she'd spoken about was the caregiver COO. And this is a person that focuses on creating a supportive and nurturing environment within the organization. And the weakness or the shadow side is overprotection and excessive leniency, avoiding tough decisions, trying to preserve harmony, becoming overly involved in day-to-day issues, preventing scalability and strategic focus. So with that weakness in play, and for that kind of caregiving CEO, what would be some tips to that person to mitigate that weakness set?
I think it's about perspective taking and also the difference between being nice and being kind and looking at your behavior. And so if you're somebody who does not like being disagreeable, disagreeability is another one of these psychological things, and yet another one of these tests. So agreeable and disagreeable is like whether or not you mind being a bit of a contrarian or causing some discomfort within an organization. And so if you're somebody who really does not like being disagreeable, really likes harmony, it is difficult to have those hard conversations, and it's easy to be a bit avoidant in those situations and easy to think about being nice and having probably been praised as a child about being nice. And isn't that a strength of yours? And nice, particularly I think for women, being nice is one of those things that we're supposed to be, but that is not the same as being kind. And I think it's much more important to be kind than it is to be nice. And so if you don't have the difficult conversations, if you don't hold people to account, if you don't give feedback so that they can do better, you end up nicing them to the point that you then have to fire them. And it's a total surprise. And actually, the much kinder thing is to give people the ability to change along the way, or the organization to develop along the way.
So number 2, the Sage COO. So this is the strategist and the analyst, leveraging data and knowledge to drive operational efficiency and growth. And the weakness of the Sage COO is analysis by paralysis and detachment. Detachment in the sense of going through intellectual exercises and thinking through great strategies and ways to be effective in the business. But when it comes to actually getting buy-in from individuals and getting the heart and soul of the business to move in a direction, there's that detachment piece where they're not particularly strong at that.
I thought sage could be part of me, but my idea of a sage was more like the wise man, because why not be gendered here, sitting on the mountaintop that everybody goes to for sage bits of advice. And I feel as though I'm that one rather than the analysis paralysis. And what I think my weakness is, if we use my definition of the sage, is I'll have a certain amount of fixed mindset because it's like my wisdom and only my wisdom, rather than being flexible that there could be other wisdom. And also because a lot of my self-esteem is wrapped up in knowing things and being the one who has seen it before, it can be hard for me to step away from what I decide is the right thing. And it's not just intellectually hard, it's emotionally hard. And so for me, that would be what it is like growth mindset has gotten me where I am, and maintaining a growth mindset, even when you think that you are the wisest person, is the challenge and the shadow side for me. And then there's also, and maybe this is another part of the sage element, is when you have another sage join the exec team. I get myself freaked out because I'm like, my role here is being...
I'm the sage.
I'm the sage. And it's interesting because part of me is like, we need more experience. I love having you at New Voice Media. We had loads of experience around the table. I was the least experienced. I was playing a different role. I really valued everybody else's experience around the table. But when I am the one with the most experience in the room, and that has become my self-worth, and then you have somebody else coming in who's like, no, I know more. That one, like even just talking about it, I can feel the tension in my stomach of like, what's my role if this isn't my role anymore? And so it's and it just the physical response I'm having talking about it right now. One, I'm feeling very vulnerable. And two, it's clearly something I need to work through because my whole body like is in flight mode over the idea of somebody taking my place. Massive shadow side rising its head at the moment.
The third one is the hero COO. So this is the action-oriented, driving the organization toward ambitious goals by overcoming challenges and inspiring resilience. That sounds totally amazing. That's you, bias for action. So the weakness here of that one is overextension and burnout, overcommitting to ambitious goals, leading to unrealistic expectations for themselves and their teams, taking on too much personally, undermining delegation and team empowerment.
That is so 100% me. That is just beyond like, taking on too much, burnout. And I think there's also, so there's the hero, and then it's tied up with the fact that you're able to do a lot of things. And so you end up taking on all these other roles. I can't remember if that was, that's another element. Charlene talked about it, didn't she? Like the ability to be big and small and the glue that sticks it all together. Yeah, this is 100% me. And a lesson I have to learn over and over again is not to push the team too hard, not to make them cry out of exhaustion and burnout, because if I can do it, the whole team can do it. Not to make myself burn out, which I think has been, I'm not burnt out, but the theme of the last few episodes has been it's dark and cold and miserable and I don't want to do anymore. So, but I'm only like rejoined for 4 months. So I'm refusing to use the word burnout here. Again, if I'm being really vulnerable and open today on all of this, is I have, instead of acknowledging the dark side, just decided to embrace that this is what I want to do and it's fun.
So tucking away the dark side into a little box.
Yeah, totally. And I'm just like, this is 100% how I want to live life. I want to live life to the fullest. There is no dark side. Let's just go. And so maybe another thing I need to explore and maybe open up that box. Yeah. And I think there are definitely ways to be more balanced. Like if I look at, instead of the fact that I'm doing too much and might possibly be burnt out, is within a business context, driving the team too hard, or sometimes I'll have a vision and I'll share the vision and then people take me literally. And then it sounds like an impossible thing to achieve. and they don't really understand how to get started. Whereas I'm like, no, no, no. I can't even think of an example. I wish I could, which would make it better. But like, I don't mean we need a crystal palace. I just need a box with some windows. And we'll get to the crystal palace, but let's do the box with windows first. And everybody's like, oh, because sometimes I'll have a vision in mind and it just gets everybody tangled up. And then they go and like way over architect what I'm talking about. And so I've learned to try and break down the vision into very small, achievable steps, but sometimes I don't do that. And then the other one is because I have this ideal that we're working towards, and I have quite a high standard, particularly for like slides and clarity of thought, that often I demand 100% and forget the 80-20 rule. And so I am trying to introduce more of an 80-20 rule for myself and everyone else of like, what is the 20% that's going to make the biggest difference, and not do the 100%, like, and which is a big departure. Because I'm not even saying like, let's do 80%. I'm saying let's do 20%, which is hard for me to get around because I want it to be perfect, but actually it's very true.
So number 4 is the last one. This is the magician COO. This is the person that envisions and executes transformative strategies to make the company a leader in innovation. So this kind of sounds like what you just talked about, actually, I think a little bit.
Yeah, I was like, okay, so I'm these two. These are my archetypes. Yeah. What's the shadow side on this one?
So the shadow side is idealism and lack of grounding.
Wait, I just talked about that, didn't I? Like, I want my crystal palace, and how are you going to get there?
Yeah, actually, I think that you're exactly right. So let me read the 2 details here. Let's see if this resonates. So overhauling systems or processes too frequently, causing disruption and confusion, and neglecting routine operations or details that sustain the business.
I think we've talked about this before, this idea of there being 3 archetypes of the way people think. This has come from a friend who worked at Bridgewater, and this is the way Bridgewater have structured their business. There are operators who deal with the day-to-day and the firefighting and the turning of the handle. And then you have the architects who build out the vision and the operational strategy, and they're thinking from 6 months to 18, 2 years out. And then you have the strategists who are like 2, 3 years to 10 years out. What's the big vision? Where are we going? And the chessboard that I can't even see. And it's around creating a team that has all of those attributes. And so I'm very much the architect, and I can be the perfect architect and forget about the day-to-day stuff. So I make sure that I hire in people who love the day-to-day. And then I make sure I partner with somebody who has that massive vision rather than trying to be all things at all times. Like, I'm never going to love grinding away on the same information over and over again.
So why don't we park it here and get on to our conversation with Divinia Knowles for part 2 and the shadow side of our strengths. We are revving up the engine of the podcast and looking for a great brand to sponsor the show. We have over 7,000 listeners now across COOs, CEOs, founders, and operational professionals who are decision makers for all kinds of technology, including HR, planning, strategy, legal, and other tools.
It's Beth here. I just wanted to thank you for listening to the podcast, and we'd love to keep it going, but we're going to need to get some sponsors in order to do that. So if you work at a company that could benefit from speaking to listeners like you, or know of a company that might benefit, please send them our way.
To find out more, go to operationsroom.co/sponsorship. That is operationsroom.co/sponsorship.
The ones that tend to come up quite a lot are caregiver, sage, the wisdom, hero. So sage, caregiver, hero, which I think is like the challenger, hero, act bravely, and magician, which is the transforming one, which you can understand because a lot of COOs end up being change and transformation leaders. So the magician who sort of does things as if by magic, often in the background, people don't see it, and then things coming into fruition.
We all have a shadow side, like a Jungian shadow side to ourselves. And I watched Inside Out 2 with one of my teenage sons, my younger teenage son, yesterday. the entire lesson was about accepting the entirety of who we are, the good with the bad, the shadow self with the light self. I just love Inside Out, like the first one. The second one maybe wasn't as compelling a story, but it was an absolutely amazing lesson to learn, and one that I think any teenager capable of doing that is amazing. I think it took me about 45 to be able to embrace any of my dark side openly. And so I just thought it'd be interesting, Divinia, to highlight areas that are like, tend to be fundamental weaknesses of COOs, or the dark side to what we view as our strengths, because it's a cliche, but it's true that every strength comes with a weakness.
And I have a feeling that it relates a lot to servant leadership, which is difficult, isn't it? Because servant leadership in one way, I feel like is a blessing and a curse, which is, so if you're in service of others all the time, which COOs generally tend to be, what I find in up and coming COOs when I'm coaching them particularly is, to use Jen Geary's phrase, there's something about teaching them to be propositional, or inviting them to be propositional, which is that they sometimes struggle to have the confidence and ego sometimes, because they're incredibly humble, usually personalities, to be really forthright and have a solid opinion, which I think can be enormously challenging. And when you look at some of these gaps, for example, the external spokesperson piece, but that's also sometimes at board level, as we were talking about last time. And sometimes I think it can be because you're expected to be in service of, and there's something about how you then frame that in your own mind as to whether therefore you're allowed to have your own opinion about where the business is going, how it's being run, the strategy, all of these other things, versus accepting what you're given in terms of, I get given a strategy and then I have to execute against it.
I was thinking about like the role of the COO and that relationship with the CEO versus the relationship with the rest of the business, and how much is servant leadership for the rest of the business versus almost like a de facto servant leadership for the CEO? And how do you have a challenging relationship with your CEO that's also effective? I mean, maybe it's just my own thing, but I'm better at being disagreeable, stating my position, having a proposition throughout the rest of the business. And it's the relationship with the CEO that I can often find more challenging, where I have either it's blatantly wrong and I will say something, or it makes enough sense that I'll just go and execute and kind of like not be bothered to think. So I don't know what that archetype is, the lazy archetype, like the lazy thinking archetype. Does that make sense? Is that something you've ever dealt with?
100%. And I think that this, back to this sort of being propositional thing, doesn't always have to be because you don't have the confidence. It could also be because you're following what you have been instructed to do. It's like, and to all intents and purposes feels like it's not a hill you want to die on. And so off you go until you realize actually in practice that doesn't necessarily work the way that anyone had thought it would. But you know, that's what came into my head as well, the relationship with the CEO, because I also find that in lots of instances when I'm working with COOs, and back to sort of the first episode we ever did, this thing about relationship is huge, right? As in, when I'm doing chemistry work with COOs who I want to work with, that one of the first questions I ask is, how's your relationship with your CEO? Let's talk about that for a bit, because generally speaking, if it's bad, it's just not going to work, right? And also then I question whether coaching them is a good idea, because it's like, if we're going to just spend all of our time talking about your relationship with your founder CEO because it's dysfunctional, then I don't think this is a good idea. That's not to say that all of these relationships are rosy. Remembering that most of those relationships, COO-CEO relationships, are on some form of spectrum. I think more often than not, when you hear about CEOs looking for COOs, one of the first things they say is partner, including sparring partner, right? So somebody I can bounce ideas off, somebody who can tell me when they think I've gone a bit sort of off-piste somewhere. And again, back to sort of the hero or the challenger, how do you do that whilst having a good relationship with them? And in a way that's more as I really like the phrase trusted advisor, so that they see that you can, in some ways, sometimes give your opinion, sometimes act as a bit of a coach and ask good questions and be curious. I think all of that then within that relationship, but not always agreeing with them. And sometimes that's okay too. I don't necessarily agree with what, the direction you're taking here, It's not to say that I won't do it. I'll do as I am bid, but I'm not entirely sold at this point. We'll see.
So those are not my challenges. My challenge is taking the time to have an opinion. Because I think there's just so much going on. And also, I love change and I love doing things. And I kind of am like, what's the worst that could happen? We can always back out. So I'm like, that sounds like fun. I'll go for it. And I don't always have that circuit breaker of actually, let me have a bit more of the 5, the analyst. Let me think this through. Because I'm like, oh, that's not fun. Let's just go. And I kind of, you completely pivot on our product and sell something brand new that we know nothing about, because that sounds like it would be an interesting project. And so for me, it's taking the time to actually decide whether or not it's a good idea, and then being the sparring partner. So I really only do that when it's just hits me between the eyes that is a really bad idea. But anything short of a really bad idea, I'm game.
And I suppose it's one of those characteristics of bias for action, which is a good quality for the most part. But I think to your point, Divinia, I think this trusted advisor, I think is absolutely spot on, which is you want to have a relationship with the CEO founder where there's inherent trust. They lean on you for thoughts, and you're in that position where whatever they're coming up with, they feel comfortable to bounce those ideas off of you. And it gives you an opportunity at that point to provide thoughts back to them in kind of an innocuous way in terms of what your view is, on that particular issue, or maybe a broader set of issues or what have you. But if you're in that space as a trusted advisor, that is a key and wonderful place to be. And I think this archetype around the sage, I think it dovetails directly into it, which is that sage quality very much is exactly this, which is you're the trusted advisor to the CEO. You're the trusted advisor to the leadership team. You're the trusted advisor across the business. That to me is like a senior CEO that really is demonstrating to the organization this person that backstops everything in a very sensible, rational, helpful way.
So this thing around lots of senior COOs that I work with have done some form of coaching qualification. And they're not necessarily going to go off and be coaches. Lots of them aren't. They're going to stay as COOs because that's what they love. However, that is because it's a skill that they really want to employ in the business, not just with the people that work with them, but with their CEO as well. So I think that's super interesting is how you develop some of this skill set. Bethany, I had a question for you because I have a feeling there's a shadow in here, which is I bump into this quite a lot with COOs. The shadow sometimes is that they're actually ruminators. And it might not be you, but it's kind of an interesting one as we talk about the shadow side. They're much better when they take things away and think about them and then come back again. Versus, you get lots of CEOs who kind of really think on their feet and can sort of hear something, data, etc., ingest something, spit something back out again that's entirely reasonable, rational. Whereas lots of COOs, again, they like to ingest information, get other data points, sort of corral everything together, figure it out for themselves and then come back again. And also they then need to give themselves the time to do that, right?
Brandon's definitely a ruminator. In terms of working together on the podcast, Brandon prepares, he has questions, he thinks about the intro, he finds themes. That would kill me. I just rock up and whatever happens, happens.
I think you're the opposite of the ruminator. I think you are the bias for action in real time. And I think that quality, I don't see that in a lot of people. And I think this is, probably one of the reasons or the primary reason why you've been massively successful, I would say.
Yeah. So we've discovered somebody else's shadow side on that one. I do like gathering information, but I don't overly gather. And I actually prefer gathering information from conversations with people than through data analysis or sitting with a spreadsheet for a long time. I love building a spreadsheet. One of my favorite things, if I have to do a spreadsheet, I save it to the end as my dessert, as my special treat.
Well, now I'm also a ruminator, which, Brandon, you can probably tell because I also am a preparer. I hear things and then I'm like, I have to go back check that. And I kind of go away and sort of talk to people and have a look at things and read some stuff, then come back again, which was always interesting for me because then in board situations, I'm very quiet because I'm sort of taking it in, trying to figure out what do I actually think. And as I said, lots of COOs that I've worked with are also ruminators and trying to see that not as it doesn't have to necessarily be a weakness or a gap. When we talk about being external spokesperson, sometimes COOs then shy away from that because they're like, well, this is not my strength versus I feel like and I'm not one of those people. I'm like a sufferer. I'll be like, I can do this. I will do this. I'll just keep throwing myself at it in some kind of form of self-flagellation. It's probably not good. But I then learned to speak in public because I kept doing it. But actually, it taught me to think more on my feet, because if you go into panels and stuff, you're asked, you don't know what you're going to get asked, do you? And you then have to be a bit more kind of like, right, I've got to sort of have a point of view very quickly. I've got to say something interesting, or at least try to at this point in time. So that actually helped me, is like not shying away from public speaking. I was like, right, if I get public speaking requests, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be in panels, definitely Q&A style, so that it'd be a bit more kind of don't know what's coming. So I'd definitely recommend that too.
I could do a panel or a Q&A any day of the week. Having to do a proper talk, I hate, because I have to think about it. I have to have topics. It has to have a flow. That gives me all kinds of stress versus a Q&A or a panel. And I find that I actually end up with better ideas and insights I hadn't come up with yet because I'm speaking off the cuff. Going back to something that you said that I wanted to get into was that you'll hear something and then you'll store it for later to investigate. Whereas I hear something and I immediately investigate then. Why don't you investigate when you first hear it?
I quite often find that there are things stored in my head somewhere that as it bubbles away, it's still in there. It kind of works its way around. Something will occur to me, or I'll think about other examples where I might have seen this before, or I'll remember an article I once read. So actually what happens in my brain, my ruminating brain, is that my brain keeps working on it. And so I find that then it kind of takes me down an avenue to then kind of go and figure something out. Or I'll be like, oh, I remember that person, actually. I'll go and have a chat with them. And I sort of come back with a bit more of a fully formed opinion. It's not to say that I won't. These days, I mean, now that I'm a sort of a bit longer in the tooth, I have a tendency I will share an opinion up front. However, I'm like, this is an unqualified opinion at this point, but my gut tells me this. I may go away, sleep on it, have a shower, think about it, and then come back with something slightly different. But generally speaking, I go away and other things occur to me. It's just the way my particular brain works. And it's not to say when I was operating slightly different, which is that I had, obviously there was sort of peacetime, but there was also quite a lot of wartime, and there'd be crisis situations that would bubble up. And then, of course, you can't do that. It's like, I need to have an opinion right now and I need to go and do something. And I would, of course, go and do that. And then you learn by making mistakes and all of that kind of good stuff. However, when I have the time, I'd rather take the time because I know my brain works better on something over a period of time. I'm okay with that. I'm a ruminator, be quite open about it. I may go away and something else may come to me. I'll come back.
So here's a question for the both of you, which is this caregiver role. So he said most CEOs come from this background or have this archetype within them. I'm curious, Divinia, if you can tell us more about why that's the case, why there's so many CEOs that are phenomenal caregivers.
I have a feeling that this is to do with that lovely living in the grey piece in organizations, right? So you end up as a COO being the person that is a commercial business person who's trying to think, right, what does the business need? What does it not need at this point in time? And also being a person who loves and cares for the team. Because again, as a caregiver myself, it felt to me when I was in organizations, even in bigger ones, that people in teams that weren't mine felt like my people. It's like, actually, the whole company is my team because I sort of work on the whole company. So I sort of worked across everything. So I then mentored people in different teams and all that sort of good stuff as well. But that living in the grey, I think, is very difficult sometimes for a founder CEO to do. And what I mean by that is, and again, sometimes founder CEOs, I think, can be a bit more business commercial and a bit cutthroat sometimes about people, honestly, which sometimes they need to be, right? If you want to have a very highly performant organization, you have to be very mindful of performance management, giving people feedback, all of this other stuff. And I feel like sometimes, because also they're the founder and there's this whole piece around founder wake, you know what I mean? Where they're kind of revered and people sort of treat them at a distance because it's like, whoa, it's the founder, et cetera, et cetera. They may be one step away from people, which allows them to have a bit more sort of objective judgment about them, but sometimes leads them down the path of not really completely understanding or knowing those people as well as they could. I feel like the COO quite often then plays the other part of that, where they do know people incredibly well if they're a caregiver and they do understand who these people are. So I have a feeling that's where this comes from, that it's sort of a yin and the yang. And again, I'm not saying that founder CEOs aren't caregivers, like they, and they're not nice to their teams. I'm not saying that at all. But I think delicate balance between building a highly performant organization and focusing on performance management and who you've got in the business and who you need and who you don't need and roles you need and all of that's this kind of good stuff. And when organizations become too bloated and all that. But I have a feeling that the COO sometimes is a foil to that, plays the other side of it.
Yeah, I'm not a caregiver.
Bethany doubles down on the cutthroat.
I think because I'm an introvert, I can have some very deep relationships with people, but it doesn't sway my opinion or my work relationship with them. Like, even if I have a very deep relationship, know about them. If they're underperforming, I will tell them. If they need to leave the organization, I will have them leave the organization, but it's separate to my relationship with them.
But I do think that's caregiving. And that's my point. And again, I don't want to offend founder CEOs, but actually I've worked with a lot in a coaching capacity that are quite avoidant.
Yeah, I would give you that.
So actually then as the COO, when I talk about caregiving, I'm more about that. Like, these people, you like them, you're friendly towards them. You may know a bit about sort of their family and all of this good stuff. And yet you will also be the person who will give them some feedback because it's kind and it's a gift. That's when I hear caregiving in COO world is actually the marriage of the two. It's not being overly soft. It's like being empathetic, but also holding the candle around being performant.
I think also for me, I don't have a lot of relationships. And so I guess I was thinking of a caregiver as somebody that has a lot of relationships across the business, maybe because of my introversion or just time. Like, I'll have limited, deep relationships and then almost no relationship with everybody else. And I don't go out of my way to have relationships. Like, I feel as though my leadership style, for the most part, does not depend on individual relationships. And those just happen because of a byproduct of working with people, or something has meant that our paths have crossed in a more meaningful way. Is there a number of relationships as part of the caregiving element?
If you think about it a slightly different way, someone characterized it really nicely for me the other day when they were talking about sometimes, dependent on your personality, you're either somebody who networks for a need because you need to do something, and therefore you go and sort of create relationships in order to do that, or you do it in of itself, as in these people are in front of you and you're curious about them and you want to sort of learn a bit about them, and you may never work with them or do something with them because of how far away in the organization they are to you. It doesn't matter anyway. You're curious enough that you would go and seek them out and figure out who they are. And I think that's a good characterization, because it's like you're more likely, therefore, to engage in social situations for no purpose. So no sort of work-related or task-related purpose. You're more likely to be there, be around. And again, it's interesting, because I would say that I'm also an introvert, and I have few deep relationships, but I'm also incredibly people curious. So I love talking to new people, but it takes me a lot of energy to do that if I don't know them. And it's a learned skill over time. Similarly, I feel like, if we think about caregiving as having these two sides of this coin, when I was younger in my career, a lot younger in my career, I feel like I was very soft indeed. So I had more of the empathy side, less of the other side, until I sort of had a bit of a realization of like, oh, this is helping people, like actually giving them feedback, making sure that they're very valued in the organization, that they're high performing, that is helping them.
I think what you said, Bethany, is right on point, which is this one-to-many leadership style where you have a large organization and you have to project yourself where people understand who you are and get some feeling of empathy or connection or resonance, or they understand who Bethany is and therefore that means something to them. Thereby, the leadership overlay on top of that becomes much more powerful in a sense. I think you're very good at this, because I think your ability to express vulnerability, openness, compassion, I think your ability to project that on a one-to-many basis, I almost guarantee you serves you quite well in terms of creating connections with individuals, even if you don't realize it.
Which happens most of the time, but I will be more because there will always be people that see something in me that upsets them because it shows something in them that they don't like. And I know that there's probably a core of 20, 30% who don't get me, like me, fear me, have whatever issues with me. But at this point, I just don't care. Like, I should care, but I don't care because I just don't have time for it. And it's a reflection of something that's going on in their own minds, not on mine. And I've set out my stall and I am who I am. And if you don't like me, then don't listen to me. Don't follow me. Don't stay at the company. There's plenty of space for people who do want to.
Should you care?
I don't know. Maybe I should care, but I don't. So it's either a light side, dark side. Don't know.
We are wired to try to figure out other people's behavior. Why are they doing that? What's going on? Or why are they doing this, that, and the other? And we fundamentally just basically guess all the time. And also, in lots of times, lots of people are not curious enough to ask what's going on for that other person. Because most times, as you say, Beth, the thing that you are receiving has got nothing to do with you. It's actually all to do with what's happening in their world and how they have therefore then the narrative they've created around it. Could be to do with you, depending on how you act towards people. I'm not saying all behavior is acceptable by any means, but quite often it has nothing to do with you. It's quite often to do with the person.
So if our listeners can only take one thing away from today's conversation, what is it?
So I'm taken back to something that we said in the last episode of this that's come up again here, which is, so how do you firstly truly embrace the things that are you? So all of the things that are you in terms of your skills, but also in terms of your characteristics, personality, that sort of thing. How do you embrace that and use that in what you do? But also, how do you acknowledge there may be shadows here, some of which you can do something about, some of which you can't, and understand them? Because I think the more self-aware we are about some of these things, the better off we'll be as to be choiceful about what we decide to do here. And if some of the points here have resonated for you in terms of development points, then there could be some areas that you may want to work on, and so take note of those.
And work on with Divinia, the COO Coach. Not that I'm just going to do the own plug for you. So if you feel like you need to do some coaching work and any of this has sparked a curiosity, highly recommend getting in touch with Divinia.
Thank you once again, Divinia, for joining us on the Operations Room. If you like what you hear, please leave a comment or subscribe, and we will see you next week.